The more important aspect than usually deciding whether someone has a disability per se is determining what the essential functions of the job are in determining whether the employee needs an accommodation. So the laws, both the ADA and the human rights law, effectively say that you have to provide reasonable accommodations um, to enable people to perform the essential functions of the job. If it's not an essential function of the job, then you may not be able to require them to do it in the first place as a condition of continuing in the position. So the first couple bullets here are more directly out of ADA regulations, and then the third specifically comes from the human rights law, but they all more or less get to the same point. So it's the fundamental job duties. It's sort of the essence of what the job entails. And in New York, the regulations suggest, would the job fundamentally change if this function was not performed by the person in it? The reason I have this picture of a man holding boxes here is pretty standard case of employers putting in their job application or their job announcements, for example, their want ads, that you need to be able to lift a certain amount of weight. Hopefully when companies are putting that in, it's because there's a legitimate requirement in the position to be able to lift that amount of weight. But historically, there have been less reputable companies that have put that in for more subtle discriminatory purposes, potentially including weeding out people who may have some physical impairments. So again, if you're stocking shelves in a warehouse, then it's probably an essential function of your job to be able to lift relatively heavy boxes. If your job usually just entails typing or sitting at a desk and only occasionally would require you to lift a box, for example, if a delivery person drops it off at your desk, then it's probably not an essential function. Again, this is really just a term we're going to come back to as we're going through some of the accommodation analysis. Here are some of the factors that get determined and whether something is an essential function. I'm not going to read all of these, but you kind of get the gist. But you can see this is under the New York human rights law regulations. The next slide will be under the ADA. They're similar, but not exact, but in neither case are they necessarily exhaustive. They're just sort of guidelines of what types of factors should be considered in determining whether something is an essential function in the first place. So again, some of the items you would look at is whether most people in that job would perform the task, whether you have written job descriptions identifying it as an essential function of the job, the amount of time that someone in that position normally spends doing the function, for example. I did want to put up one more poll here because I was curious on the job descriptions. If you know, does your organization have written job descriptions that identify the essential functions of each position? Because this really is one of the strongest legal justifications for having the written job descriptions in the first place, is being able to determine what the essential functions are. So you see some of the items that I let you choose from are based on how frequently and recently you've updated these job descriptions. So good to see that most of you have written job descriptions and review them regularly. Many companies draft them when the job is created, for example, and then don't periodically review them, so that over time, what's in the job description is not necessarily what is actually being performed. You can imagine situations where companies have been around a while and their job descriptions refer to technology that's completely outdated. Secretaries, for example, it might say they need to be able to type on electric typewriters, where hardly any workplaces are using those on a regular basis these days. Among various other things. It could be more simply you need certification to operate a certain type of equipment, and that equipment is no longer what's being used. So if you do get into an analysis of what do we have to accommodate and what is something that we don't have to, or we can't require the employee to do to remain in their position, then the job descriptions could become relevant. But of course, they're not dispositive in any situation. There would still be other factors to be considered.